In 1990, communism was on the run and Germany was reuniting. They just needed to finish the paperwork. America's Secretary of State and the West German Chancellor floated the idea that maybe the Soviet Union could accept Germany's reunification in exchange for NATO promising that it would not expand into what would soon no longer be East Germany. Bush nixed that, and the final agreement allowed NATO to expand into all of a reunited Germany. Germany. That was the subject of diplomacy between NATO and the Soviet Union. Not Poland, not the Baltics, certainly not Ukraine or Georgia. None of those countries existed as independent states with their own foreign policy, and nobody thought that they would. But a year later, they did, and the Soviet Union did not. Expanding NATO broke no promises, least of all any promises to the new Russian Federation. But that's the question that needs to be answered here. What are the Western democracies? What was the Soviet Union? What is Russia? And what are they also afraid of? To say that NATO, for Russia's sake, should uphold the non-existent promise it made to the USSR and to perceive NATO expansion as a threat to the new Russian Federation is to say at least one of two things. That the USSR was really just another version of the Russian Empire, and so is the Russian Federation, or that NATO was, and always has been, an alliance of Western imperial aggression. The extent to which either or both are true is the fuel that everyone put on this fire. We among the NATO countries need to take this seriously. We can't claim that NATO has only ever been a force for defending democracy and protecting human rights, least of all the United States. NATO has fought for these reasons, but virtue is quickly overwritten by sin, and every war of imperialism and foreign adventurism fought by a NATO country has chipped away at our credibility. Beyond guns and bombs, the United States did not offer to Eastern Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union the same kind of assistance that it gave to the UK, France, and West Germany after the end of World War II. We were a lot less FDR and a lot more Reagan in the 90s. Economic shock therapy helped well-connected people get impossibly good deals on massive industrial monopolies. And those people became the new oligarchs, lifted by a massive mountain of cash above a struggling new state. The difference between Western and Eastern Europe today is the difference between the Marshall Plan and the Washington Consensus. Reagan Jr.'s America wanted to believe that helping the powerful get rich was the way to turn a country into a democracy. But we were wrong. So the NATO countries made mistakes, very 90s mistakes. But the mistake was not in integration, it was in exploitation. People, especially people like Vladimir Pozner, say that our betrayal of our values is what pushed Russia toward somebody like Putin and created Putin as the warmongering dictator who we have today. But we didn't make Putin. This made Putin.
Преследуют террористов везде. В аэропорту. Значит, вы уж меня извините, в туалете поймаем, и в сортире их замучим, в конце концов. Все, вопрос закрыт окончательно.
Terrorism, separatism, the fear of a crumbling empire. The Chechen Wars showed the world that Russia was still a brutal imperial force, and they launched Putin into becoming its popular new president. He would respond to domestic terrorism not as a matter of law and order, but as an empire fighting a war against a rebellious vassal nation. Brutal extrajudicial killing and wars of total destruction. That is how he would sell himself to Russia as the strongman leader that they wanted to protect them. It's also how he revealed himself to the nations formerly part of the Russian Empire, that he was willing to annihilate non-Russians who tried to escape Russia's rule. So NATO expanded to include former Soviet states. Whether it was the best idea in practical terms is debatable, obviously, but in principle it was about cutting off Russia's ambitions to re-establish its empire. And there is every reason to believe that Putin would have started this war in Ukraine with or without an imagined threat from NATO, because this war is not about NATO. John Mearsheimer's newly viral lecture is about Russia invading the Crimean Peninsula and its proxy war against Ukraine in Donbas. So if he, or anyone else, wants to say that Ukraine's public intention to join NATO and NATO's intention to include Ukraine at some point in the future did something to make it more likely that Putin would do those things, then sure, it probably was a factor. To say that it was the only factor, or especially that Putin wouldn't have done those things if it weren't for NATO expansion, is to be willfully blind. To hear people like Mearsheimer and Pozner talk about it, you'd think that the offensives were part of some dramatic plan to cut off the ceremony that would forever take Ukraine away from Russia's sphere of influence and make it part of Europe. Which it kind of was. But it wasn't about joining NATO. In November 2013, Ukraine was about to sign an economic agreement that was going to be basically the first step toward Ukraine joining the European Union. And when Viktor Yanukovych started having law enforcement kill protesters for demonstrating against his last-second decision to scrap the deal, the people of Ukraine fought the Revolution of Dignity to drive back to Russia the corrupt puppet president. In March 2014, Russian soldiers swarmed into Crimea, and a month later, Russian separatists with military support from the Russian government started the Donbas war. If what Putin wanted was to keep Ukraine out of NATO, he had already achieved that twice over with Crimea and the Donbas war. As long as Russia kept those up, which they could do indefinitely, then Ukraine joining NATO would be the recipe for instant World War III. So that was it. All taken care of. No NATO for Ukraine. No invasion would make it less likely. But neither this war nor anything that preceded it is really about NATO. It's about what Putin is really afraid of. What all of this ignores or forgets or never even considers to begin with is that Ukrainians have a choice in all of this. To talk about this in terms of what we have done to antagonize Putin is to talk about it on his terms, in the way that he sees the world. And the way that he sees the world categorically excludes popular will. From his past as a KGB agent, he learned to see all people as tools manipulated by powerful state actors. In his world, there's no such thing as spontaneous protest movements or civil society or a democracy that's not rigged. To Putin, any protests or election results that are against his interests, like in Ukraine for example, are the result of Western meddling in the minds of impressionable, directionless sheep. And in his present, as an increasingly unhinged dictator, he is a student of the Russian fascist philosopher Ivan Ilyin, who he has cited many times. Ilyin has told him that Russia is necessarily a righteous and great nation, regardless of what it might do practically. And that Russians have a higher, bigger soul than other people. And that a hero must unify Russia by enforcing Russia's ability to equate law and power. Then Russia will be purified of the Western decadence that denies these truths, and Russia will be great again. Imagine those beliefs coexisting in the mind of a man who commands what was supposed to be one of the most powerful militaries in the world. Imagine him stewing with his delusions, isolated in his palace for 2 years of the COVID pandemic. Imagine what he would do after he expected to swiftly decapitate the Ukrainian government and watch the spell of Western decadence be lifted and the Ukrainians to remember that they're really Russians. But they tell him that he's wrong, and they will fight to the death to prove it to him. What would he do then? Imagine all of that, and you will understand why he started this war and how he intends to finish it. Putin wants you to believe what he believes, that the Orange Revolution and the Euromaidan and the Revolution of Dignity were all proxy conflicts with the United States, that Ukraine's shift toward the Western democracies is a result of Western manipulation. It's absolutely true that thanks to the Monroe Doctrine and communist containment and a predatory vision of global capitalism, the United States has done things like support coups and armed insurgencies. We have given a lot of guns and money to people who wanted to rule in our sphere of influence, and guns and money give people a lot of power where they don't have popular support. But that's where the influence of any world power ends. It's barely possible for a government leader to start a mass movement in their own country, let alone one in another continent. We couldn't possibly make the Ukrainians want to join the EU, or NATO, or oust a corrupt puppet, or defend themselves from invasion. The Ukrainians decided that, and they're deciding that more every time a citizen picks up an AK or fills a Molotov cocktail. This is what's just absolutely insane to me, that so many of us here are willing to say that we should have abandoned Ukraine's desire for self-determination, that we should have thrown them under the bus so that they wouldn't be picked on by the bully across the street. Like, do you want to live in that world? When Putin says, "You are Russian, you belong to me, and I will destroy you if you say no," should we then say, "I don't know, Ukraine, we'd like you to make these choices yourself, but he says he's going to destroy you, so maybe you shouldn't do anything to make him angry. And maybe it was good that Austria and Czechoslovakia were annexed into Germany without fighting over it. Maybe Poland should have rolled over too. I know they didn't want to be ruled by the Nazis, but if they had just given in to their demands, then maybe they wouldn't have been invaded. And that could have saved us a whole war in Europe." No, you don't want that world. And it's thanks to Ukraine fighting that you don't have it. For the leftists and progressives out there who want to find a way to blame us for this, I know it's because you feel like our system is illegitimate. You believe that everything our leaders do is just an arm of the wealthy business interests and war profiteers and maintaining systems of oppression over marginalized people. And you're not wrong, at least not entirely. But what you're doing is giving yourself an excuse not to do anything. To say these things, and to say these things about the war in Ukraine, is to say that all the progress that we've made is a lie, which means that all the progress we could make is also a lie, so why believe in anything? But that is just wrong. Like, democracy is real, okay? Everywhere that it's real, it's also flawed, sometimes very flawed. But one of the ways that we know that American democracy is at least somewhat responsive to the people's will is that all those terrible things that I talked about us doing were all in the past tense. We're not staging far-right authoritarian coups anymore, thankfully, and we're no longer fighting our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we haven't started any new wars since. It's that fact that puts us in a position to lead the world against Putin. There are oppressive regimes that we cooperate with, mostly because of fossil fuels, but that doesn't do anything to rationalize Putin's invasion. The point is that it's all wrong. It all needs to be fixed. And we need democratic solidarity to undo imperialism at home so we can better resist it abroad. Very slow, very frustrating, and unfair democracy that makes us angry every day, but real democracy nonetheless. And we make it better by believing in it and doing it. I know that far-right Putin fans won't listen to this or care, but for the progressives and leftists in my life and at large, don't give me your both-sidesy whataboutist cynicism. Give me your conviction to do something about it.